the computer onto the screen, and I'll try and stand in a position where I can get access to the computer, but without obscuring the screen. So, okay, a couple of words of introduction first of all. I apologise first of all that I don't speak any German. There was a time when every educated Englishman had to speak German, but that was a long time ago. So I don't speak German. But I'm going to speak a form of English, and you probably know there are many forms of English in this world. There's that kind of English that's spoken by Scottish people that English people can't understand. And then there's a form of English spoken by Americans, which is kind of like English, except they can't spell. And then there's many kinds of English spoken within England. So I've got a particular form of English, and I hope that you can understand my version of English reasonably well. Very quickly, thumbnail sketch of where I come from and what I do, and that will give you a bit of a feeling for the background to what I'm going to say. So very quickly, I was born in India. My parents were missionaries. I was brought up in Scotland, and my parents are English. We moved to England in my mid-teens, and in my adult life I've had three kinds of occupations. The first occupation was as a local pastor, trying to replant churches in some cases, trying to plant churches in other cases. So 12 to 15 years in local ministry, 15 years working for the Bible Society in a research and development role. And just to briefly explain that, we recognized that in Europe at least there was an average of 8 Bibles per household. So in terms of Bible distribution, we had done our job. But the problem is we discovered that nobody was reading those Bibles. So that was an issue. Did we care about the fact that nobody read the Bibles we distributed? And we decided we did care about that, and so we did quite a bit of research on what has happened to Europeans that they are no longer interested in the founding story of their culture. What has happened? In other words, how can you be a missionary in Europe? So I spent a long time on that particular topic, writing books and researching in that area. And then for the last 12 years, I've been leading an organization that encourages church planting amongst the denominations networks across the United Kingdom, and in conjunction with that, leading a leadership development school or a Bible college that tries to prepare people to plant the churches we're encouraging people to plant. So those two things kind of go together. Developing leaders, encouraging church planting. So that's a little bit about me. I'm a kind of Anglo-Indian Scot with a lifetime passion for church planting. I'm here today with my wife. My wife, Linda, works with me in a whole variety of situations. And we've reached that wonderful point in life where our biggest pleasure is to greet our grandchildren and to have time for them. So that's a very beautiful time in which to be. Okay, so by way of background in terms of this talk, I've called this The End of Christendom and the Beginning of Mission. And I want to explain that in my childhood and in my teenage years, I had 3 radically different experiences of the relationship between Christianity and culture. The first was on the mission field, and that was in a situation where largely animist people were eagerly embracing Christianity, and they could immediately see and appreciate the difference between the culture they had come from and the culture that Christianity brought. Whole villages becoming Christians. That was one context. The second context was Scotland, where Christendom, when I lived there, still existed. And just to remind you, because probably none of you in this room have ever experienced Christendom, what was Christendom like? Well, actually, it was a pretty good thing in some ways. It was a situation in which everybody was a member of a church. And even if they didn't attend church, they all knew which church they were not attending. It was a very different kind of relationship. If you were a leader in society, you were a leader in the church. If you were a leader in the church, you were probably a leader in society. Society and church were deeply, intimately connected. And for me, that meant as a teenager that all my friends attended church. And even my really cool friends, even the friend that introduced me to Bob Dylan's first album, even he was a Sunday school teacher. Christendom. And then we moved to England, where Christendom had already disappeared. And that was a profound shock for me. So, the end of Christendom and the beginning of mission. I want to just pause for a second with this curious phrase. Right up until the early 1960s, it was possible to buy books with that title, The Church and Its Culture. You would never write such a book now. But actually, up until that time, what happened was that church and culture were so deeply connected that when somebody would write a book, and I've got a book with that title on my shelf, when somebody would write a book like that, they were describing Western culture produced by the church. It's curious. You wouldn't write that now. And you wouldn't write that now because something happened in the 1960s that was absolutely transformative. What was that something that happened? Well, that's a really big question, actually. But let's prepare for that question by reminding ourselves that the generation that grew up in the 1960s, we call them the baby boomers because there were so many of them, that generation has actually rewritten what it means to live in each decade that they've lived in. So, for example, when they were in the 1960s, they redefined what it meant to be a teenager. When they got into the 1970s, they redefined what it meant to live as a 20-something. And so on through every decade, a 30-something, 40-something, 50-something, 60-something. And now we've reached the moment where Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney are redefining what it means to be a 70-year-old. Whoever imagined that you could be a rock star doing world tours in your 70s, especially when you lived in the 60s and you bought a song called My Generation with the line, I hope I die before I get old. Curious. But that generation has redefined every decade in which it has lived. So what's all that about? Well, that same decade also saw, according to one author, Callum Brown, the death of Christian Britain. And what Callum Brown meant by that was that the 1960s was the first generation in which parents failed to transmit the faith to their children. And so that's his definition of the death of Christian Britain, that failure to transmit the faith. That was the first time that that had been seen in Europe for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. As a matter of fact, I don't entirely agree with Callum Brown, but that's another story. But that's one of the defining marks of that generation. They were a generation that did not inherit Christian faith. What else can we say about that generation? Well, we can say that they instigated what another author has called the religious crisis of the 1960s. In fact, it's the title of a book by someone called Hugh MacLeod, and there's a little quotation from that book, which is coming up on your screen. I won't read it to you, but basically he's making the point there that in that decade, all across Europe, the beginning of a crisis where church attendance and church membership started not just to fall, but to plummet. In the case of England, church attendance halved within a single decade. That kind of decline didn't impact every European nation in the 60s in that way, but it has since that time. The religious crisis began in the 1960s. Now the point about that crisis is that it wasn't just a religious crisis. So let's move to the next slide. It was actually a huge cultural shift. It did include a crisis around religion, but it was actually a much deeper cultural shift than that. So what was going on? Well, for a start, all institutions were being questioned. And as a matter of fact, it's not just the church that's had difficulty since that time in sustaining its life. Every institution across Europe has had that difficulty. It doesn't matter whether it's a political party or whether it's the Girl Guides. It doesn't matter whether it's the social institution of marriage or the bigger institution of family. Every single institution all across Europe has had difficulty sustaining itself since the 1960s. And just to give you a feel for that, sometimes politicians say to me, oh, we don't take any notice of the church because it's in decline. I say, oh, hold on a minute. You think we're in decline? What about you? Our decline is nothing compared to the decline of political parties. In England, the Conservative Party in 1955 had 5 million members. Today, it has 130,000 and struggling to hold on to those. I can tell you there's no church decline like that. This is not a religious problem. This is a much bigger social issue that's found across every institution. And that extends to the fact that modernity, as we've known it for the last 300 or 400 years, as expressed through science and reason, is also under suspicion. We have what philosophers call the hermeneutics of suspicion, where we look at every claim that science and modernity makes. And every institution, even including medicine, the police, law, justice, we look at all those things with deep suspicion. That began in the 1960s. Other worldviews and other religions are being actively explored in ways that was not even possible before the 1960s. And that's just a normal part of life now, because we meet such people in the course of our everyday life. We've turned in other ways from being those who produce, those who work in factories, to those who consume. These are just indicators of a much bigger cultural shift that's taking place. In other words, it's not just a religious crisis, but there's social, political, cultural, and religious change taking place. Okay, so there are a number of cultural themes that underlie all this. I just want to touch lightly on them, and then we'll stop there for this morning. What are the cultural themes? Well, starting in the 1960s, there grew this huge interest in the individual. Me, myself, and I. There's no subject so fascinating as me, myself, and I. That is a cultural theme which has a particular kind of expression. Next point. It's called the self-actualization movement, and that began in the 1960s. This is about the drive to discover who I am and what fulfills me. Within that, there are a number of other cultural themes. You will hear again and again and again in the pop culture that begins in the 1960s, the theme of freedom. I want to be free. I want to be free. And freedom in the context of the self-actualization movement means to have no restraint, to have no responsibilities, not to be subject to any authority. There's a particular reading of freedom which is actually quite important. Within that context, it's the rights of the individual that matter, not responsibilities towards others, but my right to be free, and to have self-expression. The German sociologist Ulrich Beck calls this a process of individualization. I love that word actually. That's the English translation, obviously. I don't know what it is in German. It's not actually an English word, which makes it all the more interesting. But it works really well. Spell checker doesn't like it. It's not in the dictionary, but it's a great word. Individualization. No, that's exactly the way it's translated. That's why I say it's not actually a word. It's not a word in English. It's a constructed word, but it doesn't actually exist in English, which is interesting. But it's actually a great word, because you get the feeling that lies behind it, which is, this is all about a form of extreme individualism. And when you begin to see that extreme form of individualism taking effect, you begin to get an idea as to why it is that no institutions can stand, why it is that all institutions are being corroded, because actually no institution can function when the underlying cultural theme is the individual is all that matters. It's me, myself and I. It's my rights, it's my freedom, it's my self-expression, it's my willingness, my desire to have no restraint, no responsibility at all. It's extreme. And the question comes, in such a situation with such a cultural theme, how do we then live at all as a society? How do we do that? That's the cultural theme, and that's the underlying narrative that creates a missionary challenge for Christians in Europe. And just to give you a feel for how extreme that is, and then I'll end on this point and we can open up for questions. I think it's best expressed by the former Pope's PhD thesis on the author Hermann Hesse and his book Steppenwolf. He's done a brilliant analysis on that. And basically what he's pointing to is Steppenwolf as the kind of archetype of this new culture, this culture of individualization. You know the novel Steppenwolf, where the figure is described who is the ultimate autonomous self, the lonely man-wolf on the steppes, who has no connection with anybody else. And so the cultural theme that's implied here is that we're not just individuals, but we are autonomous individuals who are alone. And in our loneliness, we become isolated. And in our isolation, we become separated from people to such an extent that actually we begin to be bored. Boredom is the great cultural theme. And that boredom leads to experimentation, ever more extreme experimentation. Experimentation with risky behavior, with extreme sports, with extreme everything, until you get to the ultimate experimentation, which is experimentation with death itself. There's a fascination with death in the way in which Western culture is developing. And that's why Ratzinger called this a culture of death. He wasn't just referring to euthanasia or to abortion, although that's actually part of the picture. But he's talking about this fascination with death, which comes from our isolation, our alienation, which inevitably flows from this extreme individualization. Now that's a serious issue, because here's the point. We want to claim as Christians that the idea that you can only be happy as an individual with no responsibility and no restraint, the idea that you can only be free in this kind of way, the idea that that's the path that leads to happiness and fulfillment is fundamentally untrue. And Christians have a different message, and the Christian message fundamentally is this: actually the exact opposite is the case. We were made to be in relationship. We were made to find ourselves through our discovery of the other. That's a fundamentally different message. And that's part of the missionary challenge that we face in Europe today. Now we're going to explore that in a whole variety of other ways through some other talks later today. So I'll stop there. If there are any points that people want to make or questions that people want to ask, we have a short time to be able to do that.
I've got a question. You were talking about this sort of culture of suspicion, that even science is being sort of questioned. I mean, certainly in Britain you've got this whole new atheist movement. People like Dawkins selling millions of copies, basically saying you can explain everything with science. How do you think those two fit together?
I think the Dawkins thing is the last desperate thrashings around of an attempt to preserve modernity. And it's interesting to see how even amongst atheists, Dawkins is so unpopular. Yeah. He's generally felt to be a bit of a pain in the neck, which of course many Christians would agree with.
Could you say something about the roots or the reasons why the baby boomers decided to live their life that way? Because I think it's got to do a lot with history and with the experience they had with the institutions like family and so on. They didn't do it by random, they did it like decisively.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and actually that's one of the questions that sociologists are really struggling to answer in point of fact. One of the factors was the invention of the teenager itself. Because the word teenager didn't come into being until 1953, as far as we can tell. And the reality of being a teenager, this strange age between childhood and adulthood, didn't really arise until the post-war period. And actually that made a huge difference, because here for the first time is a generation that has money, that has disposable income beyond the kind of levels of disposable income that any other group has in society, and suddenly they're a group that are targeted by the marketeers. And in particular, marketeers in the worlds of fashion, music, film, arts, media, entertainment, all of those kinds of areas suddenly target this group, and there arises a new kind of culture which is distinctly different from the adult culture of before. This is a generation which is better educated than their parents, which no longer takes anything for granted that they receive from their parents, because they are beginning to create a new kind of world. And that's a world which, it's not insignificant that the Beatles met at art college in that teenage period. So all of those kinds of things are going on in the late 50s, giving rise to the feeling that, do you know what, we're in a new world now. And we don't receive anything that's been transmitted from that previous culture, that previous generation. Everything's being questioned. It's not just post-Christian, but we're post-industrial, we're post-colonial, we're post-everything. But interestingly now, we're even post-secular, because curiously, we're coming full circle, and once again, there's an interest in transcendence and the experience of God. Not necessarily the Christian God, but it's just a fascinating situation, all kinds of contradictions in the situation which we find ourselves in. Opportunities, contradictions. It's not a complete answer, but yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you say you write books and you've been researching this area a lot. Are there lots of sort of missionaries that focus on this cultural shift? Is there a movement there, a missionary movement, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, we spent a lot of time in the 1990s working with Leslie Newbegin and the Gospel and Our Culture movement. And we'll talk a bit more about that after the break. Okay. So we'll come back to that, but it's a really good question. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael.